Hello everyone, and welcome to my PowerPoint presentation. Today, we'll be talking about the Chesapeake Bay, but not just the Chesapeake, we'll also be going back in time to look at its history, and then we'll move forward in time to today and talk about its present issues. So, who am I? My name's Christian Carnero. I'm a graduate student at North Carolina State University, earning my master's degree in science education. So I was raised in a small town in Connecticut, right here on the west side of Connecticut, called New Fairfield. And then about 6 years ago, I moved to southeastern North Carolina in New Hanover County area, located here. And my interests include the natural sciences. Biology, chemistry, physics, all those things are of interest to me. If it's outside and it exists outside, then I'm interested in it. So when I graduated high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. Moreover, what I wanted to get a degree in. So I attended Naugatuck Valley Community College, and I took a whole bunch of random courses. Now, one of those random courses was a botany course. And this course opened my mind to the natural world around me. I can say I never looked at plants the same again. But moreover, it got me more interested in science. So I wanted to pursue science as a lifestyle, as a career, and in a degree. So I moved to southeastern North Carolina and I attended the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and I got my bachelor's degree there in marine biology. Now I love marine biology and I always have as a kid, but I discovered something about myself at UNCW. I discovered that I love to teach others. I discovered this by running study groups with my classmates, and I was just so good at teaching and talking about this that I said, hey, this might be something I want to pursue as a career. So to do that, I enrolled in North Carolina State University to earn my master's in science education so I can teach science. So my professional goals are to inspire the 3 A's in my audience. So whenever I'm conducting an informal science education program or just talking to someone, I strive to make them aware of the natural environment that we live in. I also strive to inspire an appreciation in the environment in them. And then lastly, through making them aware and then making them appreciate the natural world, I strive to have them to take environmental action to better the environment and their own lives. So, my presentation. What are we going to be talking about today? So, like I said, we're going to be talking about the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm going to give you an overview of the bay. Then we're going to move on to threats of the Chesapeake. What's currently threatening the Chesapeake? I'm going to talk about how this impacts us as humans. And then finally, we'll talk about some mitigation strategies that we can use to kind of prevent or stop these threats. So the Chesapeake Bay is located on the eastern coast of the United States, between the states of Maryland here and Virginia here. Now the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in North America. It is 200 miles long, running from north to south, and at its widest point, which is about from here to here, it's 30 miles wide. So this is just a huge body of water on the east coast. So, what does the Chesapeake Bay mean for us? Well, it has a world-renowned fishery. It's known for its seafood, specifically blue crabs. I'm sure some of you have heard about this. But moreover, this fishery is worth billions of dollars. So that's big doings in terms of fisheries. But it's not just commercial. It also has numerous recreation opportunities. Some of these recreation opportunities include fishing, boating, birding, swimming, and surfing. Christian, you just told us that this is an estuary. How is there surfing in an estuary? Well, at the mouth of the bay, there's actually enough wind and waves to accomplish successful surfing. I've seen it done on a couple documentaries. It's actually pretty interesting. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed is no less impressive than the Chesapeake itself. It covers 64,000 square miles and has over 150 major rivers and streams emptying out its watershed. And this watershed, so big that it covers 6 states plus the District of Columbia. And over 18 million people live in the estuary, live in the Chesapeake Bay's watershed. However, all these people in this area has consequences for the health of the Chesapeake that we'll talk about later. So, how did the Chesapeake Bay form? Well, I'm going to take you back to the Eocene period, or the late Eocene period. So 35 million years ago, there was a meteor impact off the coast of the eastern United States. And this caused depression in the land. But as we know, water flows downstream. So rivers like the Susquehanna flowed into that depression. And over thousands of years, maybe even millions of years, it created deep gorges in the land, creating river valleys. The Susquehanna River Valley was estimated to be upwards of 400 feet deep. We now come to the end of the Pleistocene era, the Ice Age. And as the Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted, and this caused sea levels to rise. But as the sea levels rose, they flooded into these river valleys, left by the Susquehanna River and others, thus flooding the river valleys, which now kind of makes up the bay. However, the river valley was 400 feet deep. Why is it so shallow now? Well, due to a process called sedimentation, sediment flowing from upriver flowed down into the bay and thus laying sediment at the bottom. So now it gives the Chesapeake Bay its characteristic depth of 21 feet average depth. So next we're going to talk about the ecology of the Chesapeake. So we're coming back to modern day now. So there are over 3,700 species of plants and animals that inhabit the Chesapeake Bay today. And I'm going to just go over some of the more notable species with you all. So we have the striped bass, which in Maryland is known as the rockfish. The humpback whale also visits the Chesapeake Bay during the summertime, I believe. Next, we have the famous blue crab, as you can see pictured here in this picture. We also have eastern oysters, which make up a good part of its hard-bottom structures. Brown pelicans can be seen flying above the bay and diving into the water after fish. And then we also have smooth cordgrass lining the surrounding part of the bay, and this makes up the majority of the marsh area. And lastly, we have something called eelgrass. And this eelgrass can be pictured here. And this makes up the huge grassy bottoms of the bay that's home to species like the blue crab. So, the Chesapeake Bay has a number of key environments. Some of those key environments are its marshes, its beaches, the seagrass beds made of eelgrass that we just talked about, its open waters, the rivers flowing into it, and the tidal flats, which occur mostly in the northern part of the bay. And these key environments provide essential habitats and resources for many of the species that I mentioned earlier. So, the Chesapeake Bay was considered the most biologically productive estuary in the world. However, until recently. So, we'll get into that. But what do I mean by productive? Well, in terms of biology, there are two kinds of productivity: primary productivity and secondary productivity. Primary productivity can be defined as the amount of biomass produced by plants during photosynthesis. But the rate of productivity is dependent on the availability of nutrients. Which nutrients? Well, phosphorus and nitrogen are some of the key players in primary productivity. So why is the bay not as productive as it once was? Well, the answer to that is hypoxic and anoxic conditions. Hypoxia and anoxia, oh my! Well, in reality, this is actually no joke, and this has serious implications for the health of the bay. So, hypoxic conditions, or hypoxia, can be defined as can be defined as little dissolved oxygen in the water. Whereas anoxic conditions, or anoxia, means there is virtually none or absolutely no dissolved oxygen in the water. The image on the right here shows hypoxic conditions, and the red here is more hypoxic conditions and the lighter colors are less hypoxic conditions. So we can say that the red has a lower amount of dissolved oxygen than, say, this blue region here. So the Chesapeake Bay is suffering from a shortage of oxygen. And these areas of the bay with little oxygen, hypoxic conditions, or no oxygen, anoxic conditions, are known as dead zones. And organisms that used to live in these areas can no longer survive because they breathe oxygen. So we see here, this black part here, right here, is an anoxic condition, and all around there is hypoxic condition. So I doubt that little animals can actually survive here, specifically in that black zone. So we can classify that as a dead zone. So how do dead zones occur? Well, if you recall, I said that 18 million people live in the 64,000 square mile watershed that is the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. And that area is used for all kinds of things. People use it for agriculture, residence, and industry. But as it rains, the water runs off farms and residential areas. And all the water flows from those 150 rivers and streams that I mentioned earlier down the Chesapeake Bay watershed and into the Chesapeake Bay. But what's that water carrying? It's carrying excess nutrients. So how do these excess nutrients equate to dead zones? Well, if you recall, I said that primary productivity is the biomass produced by plants. And this plant productivity is dependent on nutrients. And these excess nutrients that are washing into the bay are, you guessed it, phosphorus and nitrogen. And what this does is this creates unregulated growth of algal blooms. So how is this bad? More productivity, right? Well, we're going to get into a couple scenarios. One scenario is that these algal blooms bloom out of control, and they act as clouds of sorts floating over the bay. If you recall, we have seagrass on the bottom, which provides essential habitat to a lot of species like the blue crabs. Well, these seagrasses can't photosynthesize if they can't get sunlight. So these algal blooms floating across the top of the bay act as clouds of sorts and block the sun from hitting the seagrass beds, thus disrupting the seagrass habitat below. But that's not the worst part. So we have these huge algae blooms in the bay, but just like every other living thing, they eventually die. So they die and then they sink to the bottom. And at the bottom, they're consumed by bacteria in a process called bacterial respiration. And these bacteria use oxygen during the respiration process. So these large algal blooms are getting used up by bacteria, which in turn are using up large amounts of dissolved oxygen in the bay. And this creates hypoxic and anoxic conditions, which, of course, equate to dead zones. And these dead zones result in mass die-offs of fishes, crabs, and oysters, and a lot of other things that make up the bottom of the food chain. Now, this disrupts the fragile ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay and ultimately reduces the productivity that the bay was once known for. So, what does this mean for us? Well, who out there likes seafood? I know I do. Well, with these dead zones in the bay, there's a reduction in the availability of seafood in the bay. Also, fishermen who rely on fishing the Chesapeake Bay for their livelihood is now in jeopardy because there's all these dead zones around, and the areas that they normally could have fished, they can't anymore because nothing lives there. In addition, this also has a detriment to tourism. So as the algal blooms bloom, they can often poison the water, which means you can't swim in it. In addition, The algal blooms poison the water and create large numbers of dead fish, and these fish wash up on the beach. I remember back in 2019, I visited Calvert County, Maryland, which is on the west side of the Chesapeake Bay, and at this one beach, there was just dead striper everywhere. It was a little disgusting, actually, and I didn't want to hang out there, so you can imagine how the Calvert County government and other coastal communities on the Chesapeake feel about dead zones. So I'm going to give you 4 mitigation strategies that you can use to help reduce dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay. That is, reduce use of fertilizers, clean up after your pets, create green infrastructure, and reduce your meat consumption. So we're going to go over these in a little bit more detail. Mitigation strategy number 1. Try not to use fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. However, if you must use them, try to use them sparingly and infrequently. It's important not to fertilize your lawn or use pesticides around your house before a rainstorm, because that's just going to wash everything that you put down off into all those runoff areas that we talked about earlier. It's just going to wash downstream and ultimately end up in the bay. Also consider using organic fertilizers. Mitigation strategy number 2. Clean up after your pets. If you're walking your dog and your dog poops outside, please pick it up. But make sure you properly dispose of its waste. Don't just throw it into the woods, because the rains that ultimately come will wash that poop downstream. And that poop is rich in nitrogen, one of the rate-limiting factors that has something to do with the algal blooms. Mitigation strategy number 3. Create green infrastructure. You can plant a rain garden. So what's a rain garden? It's basically a bunch of plants in a low-lying area that soaks up the water that runs off from roads and sidewalks and other things like that. We see a picture of a rain garden here on the right. So as water would flow down this road in a rainstorm, it would flow down the chute into this rain garden, and the rain garden would help soak up some of those nutrients that otherwise would flow down the road and then maybe into a stream and then into the bay. Another thing you could do is replace your old pavement with pervious pavement. That's to avoid runoff. So instead of the rain running off your driveway into the road and the storm drain down the stream and into the bay, instead it's soaking into the ground. And the ground helps bind those nutrients. And then one more thing you can do is you can preserve existing trees on your property, and if you're like me and you like a little bit of foliage around, you can plant new trees. The last mitigation strategy is to reduce your meat consumption. So a lot of the agricultural production in the United States is allocated to feeding livestock like these cows here pictured on the left. So if we eat less meat, that means there's less fertilizers ultimately going to growing the crops that feed the cows and the chickens and the pigs. Also, this makes for less animal waste if you reduce your meat consumption because there's less demand. Remember that this animal waste is rich in nutrients that can ultimately help the algae bloom and then ultimately create dead zones. So today I gave you an overview of the Chesapeake Bay. We talked about its size, significance, and its watershed. Next, we talked about some threats to the bay, mainly nutrient loading. And then I also talked about its consequences for us: less seafood, fishermen's livelihood in jeopardy. I also talked about how this can cause detriment to tourism. And lastly, I gave you 4 mitigation strategies to help reduce dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay. Here are my references. Does anyone have any questions? And if you do, please feel free to email me at any time. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you learned something today.